started. So, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Andrew Johnson. I'm the Manager of Space Policy and Regulatory Systems at the New Zealand Space Agency, which is a part of the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment and sits within the Science, Innovation and International branch. So a very warm welcome to you all, and thanks very much for coming along to this Techweek event this evening. It's wonderful to see so many people interested in participating in a conversation about the future of space in New Zealand. So first, just a couple of housekeeping issues. You'll see the two exits marked above you at the back of the theatre. If you follow those out and find the staircase, I understand there's one on the left and one on the right, and go up both of those staircases in the event of an emergency evacuation. And the meeting point is out on Grafton Road. There's also a number of toilets very close to the exits outside as well. So firstly, I would like to extend the Space Agency's and Ministry's thanks to our partners for this event, the University of Auckland, Auckland Uni Services, and of course, a huge thank you to all our panellists who have agreed to take part in tonight's event with all their busy schedules and come along to speak to us today. New Zealand is a home to an innovative and already growing space economy powered by highly skilled workforce of pioneers, researchers, computer scientists and engineers. With Rocket Lab having well and truly shown their capability, New Zealand is now a major player in the small satellite launch market. The New Zealand Space Agency is committed to supporting the growth of a safe, responsible and secure industry that benefits all New Zealanders. Our activity spans administration of the Outer Space and High Altitude Activity Act, passed in 2017. Determining New Zealand's space policy is a direct result of administering that act and participating in international fora around the world, and supporting the development of the space economy. The benefits of the space industry can be found across all aspects of our society, from the satellite TV that we watch at home to the accuracy that GPS provides our emergency services operators. Earth observation data is used to improve agricultural productivity, and new space technologies are constantly being developed that have the potential to improve the lives of all New Zealanders. Some of the people developing these new space technologies are on our panel tonight, and it is my pleasure to introduce each of them. We have a fantastic group of thought leaders, innovators and researchers who represent the future of our space economy. So firstly, from the Auckland Program for Space Systems, we have the program's director, Jim Hefke. We also have Dr. Nicholas Rattenbury, who is the APSS's science lead and is also a Royal Society of New Zealand Rutherford Discovery Fellow. We have Dr. Delwyn Muller, who is a radar systems engineer. Previously, he's worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and served as the first director of research at the Centre for Space Science Technology, now called ZERA. Will Harringer is the business director for Zeno Astronautics, a satellite propulsion company based here in Auckland. Anastasia Kiddle is a physics and applied mathematics student, and she is a team member of the Kessler program, which is a CubeSat group here at the University of Auckland. And Jonathan Mace is a mechanical engineering student, and he's the team leader of the Kessler program. In a moment, I'm going to hand you over to the panel. They have some time for each of them to introduce themselves in a little bit more detail, about 5 minutes or so for each panellist, and then we're going to move to hopefully what will be a really dynamic and interactive Q&A section of the event. We've created an interactive Slido link for you to ask questions, so if I just try and bring that up now. So we have a question section and also a poll that we've put on that Slido link. So the hashtag is hashtag L527, and the website, if you're going through the web, is slido, sli.do. And we put a poll on there, so I'd encourage you all to get involved. And the question is, what is the most crucial element to make progress on if New Zealand were to become a centre for small satellite manufacturing. And we've got 5 options there, from a skilled workforce through to access, research and development infrastructure, to finance, to the regulatory environment, to international expertise. And that's just something hopefully to get people interested in using the tool, but what we'd really love to hear from is your questions that we can then put to the panellists. We can use the tool live in the event, as well as having microphones going around the room. So the first part of the event will be the introductions from the panellists and then the Q&A session. And then at the end of the event, there'll be some free pizza available, so please do hang around and take the opportunity to mix and mingle with the panellists. Right. Ooh, sorry. So, without further ado, I'll start with introductions for the panellists to come up and speak in a little bit more detail. And if it's okay, we might start with Nicholas to come give us a first introduction. So.
Thank you very much. You haven't even heard me say anything yet. No class of mine ever says never pause first. Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, ko Nick Rattenberry aho, ko kai ako aho I te whare wangara o Tamaki Makaurau. I'm Nick Rattenberry. I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Physics. I am an astrophysicist, and my training has been in the discovery of extrasolar planets, discovering worlds outside those in our own solar system. But for the last 2 or 3 years, I've pivoted to putting my time and energy towards promoting New Zealand's activities in space. We have this incredible opportunity now, thanks to a local industry, Rocket Lab, giving us access to space frequently and relatively cheaply. And what we also see at the same time is a change in thought about how we can make use of space through small satellites. So the technology has changed so much. We now are able to do meaningful and real science and technology missions in a small form factor. And so this is part of what drives me, is we now have the ability technologically to engage, enable a wider fraction of New Zealand science and engineering and broader society into doing research in space. And that's because we are able to package a great deal of power into a small volume. We can make small satellites which can do Earth observations through to astronomical observations. And so as a scientist, that's what drives me. Getting to space, we're able to do more of the sort of science which I'm particularly interested in. I've always said that I want to build New Zealand's first space telescope, and that's one of the things I want to do before my career is over. We'll see how we get there. So what I'm particularly keen about emphasizing is the research projects that we're doing at the University of Auckland. You'll hear a lot about what we're doing at the undergraduate level. So this is programs which are designed to engage undergraduate students into space, science, engineering, and across the university, from business, law, commerce, and the arts. We'll hear from Jim, William, Anastasia about that. So what I would like to talk about is the research that we're doing. And we've identified a number of projects, research areas, which are of particular interest to the small satellite community, and one of those is propulsion. So when you have your satellite up in orbit, you need to be able to push it around a little bit, well, you'd like to push it around a little bit, change its orbit, change its orientation, and you don't have the luxury of having a great big tank of propellant to do this. It's a small satellite, so it means that you have less in terms of volume and mass budget. So we're looking at innovative ways of pushing a satellite around in orbit, and that brings us to electric propulsion, using, instead of combusting materials to give you a rocket effect, to shove basically combustion products out the back end of a rocket, you know, a la Apollo 13 and all the rest of it. We're using things like ion thrusters. We're using highly charged particles, shooting out the back of a little nozzle to propel the spacecraft around. It's not nearly as glamorous as a great big plume of material coming out the back of a rocket, but it's certainly a lot more efficient in many ways, and it's suitable for small satellite projects. So we have in the physics department an ongoing plasma propulsion system design and analysis program, which is exciting. We're also looking into what can be done thinking inside the box in terms of these small satellites. And when I mean small, I'm talking about the smallest unit that we're thinking about in practice anyway is 10 centimeters cubed. They're very small. But you can stick these together so you can get a loaf of bread size one, or maybe one about this big. So we're not talking about things which are the size of a dishwasher or a car. We're talking about small little satellites. And Rocket Lab is designed, they have positioned themselves to service this CubeSat market because they designed and built their Electron launch vehicle to accept and deploy these CubeSat format satellites into orbit. So we rock up with our satellite, they know it's exactly the right form that they're expecting, we shove it into the kick stage. This is all technical talk, obviously. Take, shove, launch, deploy, yeah. There's more to it than that. But they've set up their business so that they can offer launch services to people like me, people like us who are doing research at universities, thanks to this now de facto standard for small satellites, the CubeSat format. And another project, along with the propulsion project I just mentioned, we're looking at synthetic aperture radar. This is so theory has been known for some decades, and we're trying to push that down to see what can be done with smaller and smaller satellites because they're cheaper to launch, but we have improvements in signal processing technology, which we've got available through our colleagues, one of whom is here, Muller, and her company in the States. And also just the abilities we have now with signal processing. We're able to fudge signals so that we can make more of what we've got. And so these are the sort of projects that we're looking at the research level, and I think I'm getting the nod now that I think my time is now up. Thank you very much, and look forward to the questions that you have. Kia pai te hui. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. Could I ask Delwyn to come up and introduce yourself?
Okay, just for ease, I'm going to stand here. So, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Darwin Muller. So, to give you a little bit of background, I'm a payload person. My background is radar remote sensing, primarily for looking at Earth and the Earth's processes. So that's kind of the perspective I'm going to be coming from is I'm like, what can we do with the capacity that we have to do some science with it? And I'm the engineer that will try and design that. So that's kind of the vantage point that I'll be coming from. So for New Zealand in space, if we want to have a presence in space around that Earth observing type of capability, well, there's a continuum. There's this continuum of missions that have been going on for decades and advancing in all kinds of different aspects. So the graphic here is to kind of one illustration of that. And these are primarily, just happens to be US, mostly satellites, that observe some aspect of the water cycle. So an area that I've been very interested in. So given that there's this continuum in any aspect that we're looking at, where can we kind of plug ourselves into that to be a meaningful player in this arena? And just a little bit more perspective. So this was the first mission I worked on when I graduated and went to JPL. And it was a really cool mission to work on. It was a shuttle mission, so that was neat. I got to hang out with astronauts and total geek heaven. And it mapped the globe in 11 days, plus or minus 60 degrees latitude. It's a benchmark data set that's still used today. But if we look at the scale of this is why I put this up here. It's not just nostalgia. This boom here that was deployed from the payload bay once it opened up was 60 meters long. It's huge. And so we have an antenna at the end here, and then we have another antenna, a bigger planar antenna, and in the payload bay here, these doors open up, and behind that we have a ton of electronics. This thing was massive. It was a major engineering feat, but it was a big scale, very expensive, and large. So now, quite a few years, nearly 2 decades later, we still have those large-scale missions, but there's also been a shift in terms of accessibility to space, and it's been twofold. One is technology advancement for more compact sensors, like we're talking about with synthetic aperture radar, for example. We have an example down here of this taking those racks of equipment that were behind the antenna can now be in a small little module like this. Now, except for the antennas and the transmitter, all the digital hardware, all the digital processing, the multiple channels can now go into these tiny units that replace racks of what were previously racks of hardware. So that's significant. The other side of things is the accessibility to space is increasing with decreasing launch and spacecraft costs for smaller vehicles. And of course, Nick already brought up Rocket Lab, that I'm sure we'll hear their name a number of times tonight, but that becomes a game changer. And I'd like to point out also, they've got 150 kg payload. It's not that small. So we can actually get some really high fidelity science sensors into that now by the meeting of the more compact technology, but also the capability that's brought about that is accessible to non-major nations through capabilities like Rocket Lab is offering. And one thing that's significant in my field of work, since I tend to be in radar and we're active sensors, is that it's now feasible to get radars on small sats or CubeSats. And so there are some commercial efforts going along that, but also here at the University of Auckland, we have some of this hardware and there's some research going on in developing that capacity as well. So the next couple of slides I'm going to just skip through because I've got told I have too much material. So I'm just going to hit a high point. So a New Zealand space program, why would we want to do that? Well, I'm going to hit the blue here. Inspire and educate. And also the other aspect is, space is supposed to be about inspiration and possibility. So let's be bold and inspirational and think about compelling things we could do. And right now, where do we stand? In New Zealand, we've got the cool ride down the road, which is really, really neat. Rocket Lab has inspired people. We've got the cool ride. Now, what's the cool thing we're going to do with that cool ride? That's what I want to think about. So what can we do that's meaningful given that we have this really cool ride into space? And so along those lines, how would we bring this together to do something cool? Well, what would we do? That's really, I think, the key thing. And for me, thinking in my way with my background for the various space agencies, I think I'm mission-centric. Okay, so how do we as a nation decide what we would like to achieve and how we fit into that continuum? How do we inject ourselves into that continuum of missions in a meaningful way? So I'd say New Zealand needs a New Zealand-driven but globally relevant mission to form around. So it's relevant to our needs, but we need to be globally relevant too. And that defines how we segue into the mission continuum. And there's a methodology for doing that, and we're at a place right now where we have capacity building and capacity that we can build upon. And how do you transform that into actually getting towards a New Zealand relevant but globally relevant mission? And there's a number of mechanisms for doing that once you've identified what it is you're trying to do, and the community then can form around that. And that takes a form of partnerships, both with international, public-private. Public engagement is key, especially if you're talking some sort of national identity. And also identifying key enabling technologies that might be relevant for New Zealand and cross-cutting, etc. And that's kind of your targeted research part of things. But then what comes out of that actually grows the community. And the community will then expand, and there'll be out of that national pride, national identity, next generation mission. So now you are part of that mission continuum and that space community. And along those lines, we can then foster the idea, should it be an Earth observing type of capacity, of our role in terms of fostering kaitiakitanga, but at a global level. So I'm going to end it there.
Jim. Try this. Where's that radio mic? Not going to work, is it?
Okay, looks like I'm going to be stuck back here. I hate being stuck behind a podium. I really, really do. Sorry?
The main microphones at the beginning at the front there.
These ones?
Yep, turn that one on.
Hello? Hello? Nope. It tried. I think these two are changed. Yeah, there's a switch. No, this one. Is that one working? No, it stops working as soon as I start talking. Is it trying to tell me something? Is it really? Nick used a radio mic. How come Nick got to use a radio mic and I don't? Okay, I'm stuck behind here whether I like it or not. I'm a wanderer. Thank you, Andrew. My name's Jim Hefke, and I run the Auckland program for space systems. Oh, now here's a man trying to figure out what's going on. Yeah? Give that a go. Okay, I'll give that a go. That one's all right. It loves me, finally. Okay. The talk tonight is the future of space. Okay, so what is the future of space? Well, we don't really know, and the other thing that we don't know is what the future holds for our graduates. So what I teach engineering management. Space is kind of a hobby of mine. I got lucky over the years, managed to turn my hobby into a job. All right, so that's pretty cool. What we do know for our students is that the future is going to be complicated. We know that they're going to be asked to be solving more and more complex problems. They're going to have to work with a very diverse group of people that don't think the same way that they do. And they're going to probably be working in an unfamiliar environment. And that's the future for all of our engineering graduates, well, all of our graduates full stop really, particularly engineering where I teach. But when you think about it, space is an extremely good analogy for that. Okay, so we have an unfamiliar environment. All right, generally the problems are complex that they have to solve. And generally they're going to have to be working with large groups of people that don't think the same way that they do. So that's where the Auckland Program for Space Systems is actually being used to help our graduates prepare for their future. That's got a lot to do with it. When you think about it, the satellites in low Earth orbit tend to be inwards looking, all right? They're looking down at the planet. They're solving problems for humanity. So we need to get the humanities involved in the first instance to identify the problems. Once those problems are identified, then nowadays with space becoming more and more privatized, we have to throw a business case around that, all right? So we get the business people involved. Now, once the business people are involved, the business case is wrapped around it, it looks like it's a go-ahead, you know, let's go and do this thing. Now the scientists come along. So Nick and his crowd come in, and they start to decide what kind of data do we need, what kind of sensors do we need, what's the actual science behind all of this that we need to collect while we're in space. Once we've got that, then the engineers come in, and we build stuff. All right, so the engineers build it. Once it's built, it gets launched thanks to Rocket Lab and people like Rocket Lab, companies like Rocket Lab. It goes up into space. And once it's into space, now the computer and ICT people start to take the data streams that come down from the satellites. So remember that the satellites are only generating data streams. Realistically, that's all they're doing. They're sending data back down to Earth. Computer and ICT people manipulate that and come up with a solution to the problem that the humanities came up with in the first place. So this is where the space program is an ideal analog to what the future holds for a lot of our students. Shouldn't turn my back on the camera, should I? I'm naughty that way. Right, let's try this. Okay, so what is the APSS? It's a student-led cross-faculty program, and we ask them specifically to identify a need to benefit society. We ask them to form their own team. We ask them to develop a solution to a problem that they've come up with themselves, submit a formal proposal, and a poster and a video. All right, so we do all of this all extracurricular. The students aren't actually being, there's no credit involved in it, okay? They do it because they want to do it. And we try and mix it up and make it as complex as we can for them, okay? We don't want to make it too easy, do we, guys? No, I know that. So what we end up with at the end of it is a lot of proposals, and these are some from our first year that you see up there, the first year that we run. We're in our third cycle now. So what we do at the end is we decide on 3 winners, and they're not based on first, second, or third. They are most benefit to New Zealand, most likely to succeed, and most ambitious, which is a little bit like, you know, you're nuts, but it's a really cool idea. It'll never work. And the most likely to succeed is the one that we go ahead and build. And you'll be hearing from Kessler a little bit later on. We are right now about to deliver our first satellite to Rocket Lab, student-built undergraduate. And it's the first. Kessler, who you'll hear from later, is working on the second. But for us, the thing to remember is that, for me anyway, the way I've set the program up, space is just the hook, okay? Auckland Program for Space Systems. So today it's Space Systems. If this program had been run 100 years ago, we probably could have called it the Auckland Program for Steamships. If the ice caps continue to melt 100 years from now, you know, it could be the Auckland Program for Submarine Settlement. The simple truth is that what we're doing with the program at the undergraduate level is challenging our students and preparing them for the future. Okay? Space is just a vehicle, it's just a hook, and that's the way that we're running it. Thank you very much. All right, you can just get out of that.
Great, and now we'll hear from Will Haringa.
Cool. Hi, so I'm Will from Zeno Astronautics, and Zeno Astronautics is in the business of satellite propulsion. So our method is powerful superconducting magnets that interact with the Earth or the geomagnetic field or other satellites. That allows us to do some interesting things like rendezvousing with other satellites for repair or refueling, as well as sort of the full suite of orbital maneuvers, so secondary insertions, changing your orbit in any way, avoiding space debris, an increasing problem, and then end-of-life deorbiting. And we initially starting with CubeSats, so those are these sort of shoebox-sized things that weigh about 4 to 10 kgs, as opposed to traditional satellites, which are the size of an SUV or a school bus and weigh about 4 to 6 ton. So where did Zeno begin? We were one of the teams in the inaugural year of the Auckland Program for Space Systems. That's where I met Max and Sebastian, the 2 founders. We submitted a mission design proposal and did not win, so we decided to independently go out and pursue it as a startup. I guess I'll talk a bit about what it's like being a startup in the space community in New Zealand. One of the good things is that in New Zealand, the space industry is still in its infancy. So it's a group of people that all know each other rather than sort of hundreds of corporations with thousands of employees each. It can sometimes be a bit sort of faceless. I think it's probably telling that probably all the panelists knew each other or had met each other before this event. And going into sort of meeting new people, that tends to be the rule rather than the exception. And in our experience, the community does seem to come together and try to help each other out where possible. Even globally, the sort of wider space sort of economy is fairly sort of insular. It's fairly, there's a lot of people who transition between organizations. It's quite a tight-knit community. For one, there's a sort of a vast body of regulatory work, space laws, so we're all sort of in the same boat together regardless of what country you're operating from at some level. In Zeno, we work with local research institutes as well as sort of a network of global part suppliers and strategic business partners. And then the New Zealand Space Agency has been incredibly helpful in fostering good relationships with Europe, the European Space Agency, NASA, and as well as other US regulatory and commercial parties, so that aids us in our sort of job a lot. In terms of, I guess, the difficulties of being a startup in New Zealand, there's probably 3. One of them is, given the relative infancy of space here in New Zealand, no university in Auckland, in New Zealand offers aerospace engineering. So that means that there's a lot of self-taught, self-directed learning. As a note, if anyone wants to learn orbital mechanics, just play Kerbal Space Program. It's a great game, and I'm not being paid for saying that. Well, the other thing is, there's sort of a maxim that is, when you're launching a satellite or building space hardware, if the paperwork doesn't outweigh your rocket, you're not ready for launch. So there's literally tons of paperwork. And that means that sometimes accessing relevant legal counsel on space law can be quite challenging here. So very, very few people in New Zealand who know much about space law. Lastly, on the funding route. So credit to New Zealand, we have a very robust sort of seed and investment ecosystem. However, space startups are usually capital intensive, and bootstrapping is hardly an option. So sometimes that can be a bit difficult in the startup context. However, two things to note there. One of them are these are not insurmountable problems, and B, this will likely change as the ecosystem matures. Lastly, probably to sort of any student or anybody really is thinking about starting a startup, some points to remember. One of them is that New Zealand is rated the #1 country in the world for starting a business and #5 for doing business. We are globally very politically stable, very uncorrupt, and we have a high level of social security. So I guess in closing, if you are thinking about starting a startup, if you have that as a question, my answer would be give it a shot.
Thanks very much, Will and Anastasia.
Hi, so I am a physics student, obviously. So I work for Kessler, and Jonathan will tell you more about that. But my primary role in the team is with the electron emitters. So I focus on sourcing, designing, and basically researching them. So it's quite cool. I've been able to communicate and talk to people, professionals in the industry, and I think that's an amazing opportunity, considering I did not come from a science background besides obviously physics again. I didn't know much about it. I didn't know much about electron emitters, and it's been really amazing working with Jonathan and everyone else learning about these things. It's a really cool experience. Yeah, don't have much else to say besides it's cool and anyone can do it.
Thanks, Anastasia. Now, Jonathan.
Hey everyone. So as Jim said, the real purpose about APSS is identifying a problem in society that you want to solve. So I'm the team lead of our second CubeSat team we've called ourselves Kessler. We identified the problem of space junk, because when you put something up in space, it actually stays up there for a really long time, on the order of decades, if not hundreds of years. Now this is actually a really good thing. While your satellite's still working, you kind of want it to stay up there. But then once it stops working, either intentionally or something goes wrong and it breaks, you can't talk to it, you can't control it, and it's stuck up there. The important thing is you can't control it. There's a risk of it crashing into other things up in space. And while space is really big, it does happen. It has already happened. In 2009, a defunct Russian satellite collided with a functioning communications satellite, creating thousands of little bits of debris. And the problem is that one satellite collision can create thousands of bits of debris that can then go on to create more satellite collisions and more fields of debris and create a snowball or a runaway effect, deemed the Kessler syndrome, hence our CubeSat's name. So we wanted to focus on we wanted to focus on space junk. The infrastructure that is up in space that we depend on daily is immense, and you probably don't even notice it half the time. From GPS to communication satellites to like planet sensing and all that sort of stuff. It's immense, and if that were to go because of a runaway Kessler effect, the events would be catastrophic. So what we decided to focus on is a technology called electrodynamic tethers. It's a really long cable that stretches out from a satellite. And as it orbits the Earth, this long cable interacts with the Earth's magnetic field in sort of the same way that, using the same principle that powers electric generators or electric motors. We use literally the entire Earth's magnetic field as a way to slow down or break our satellite. What we want to do is we want to chuck a satellite up in space, deploy this tether, and prove that it can be used to slow down a satellite. If we can do that, then we think that it can be a viable solution to help slow down and deorbit satellites in the future at the end of their lives, so that they don't stick around in space and become a problem. Further, this has already been done by NASA in the past. They deployed a 20-kilometre long tether. The trouble is, deploying a 20-kilometre long tether isn't really feasible or cheap or lightweight for satellite manufacturers. Putting it on a 1U CubeSat, something that can fit in the size of your hands, that is cheap, that is lightweight, that is affordable. And so by scaling it down, miniaturizing it, and proving that it can work on that scale, we think has a really it has a really beneficial impact on the entire space industry and sort of our futures, because our lives depend on space. It really does. Yeah, you can ask me questions about what it's like being on a CubeSat team, leading a CubeSat team. It's been a very interesting journey so far, and it's going to continue being an interesting journey. I've had to learn how to lead a team and lead people, and learn how to build a satellite, because that's really hard, and you don't go in knowing that stuff. But it's incredibly rewarding. I get to actually work on something that, during my university studies, that actually has a real physical output. At the end of the day, I get to make something that's going into space, and I don't think I can say that about any of my other engineering courses. And also I get a chance to work on something that might actually make a difference in the future. It's fascinating. It's really cool stuff. Anyway, thanks for your time.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks everyone for those introductions. Now we're going to move to the exciting part of the event where we get to take your questions. You can direct them at any individual panelist member, or if there's a more general question that everyone could respond to, that's fine as well. We have a number of questions on the Slido tool, but perhaps we'll start with if there are any questions in the room that we could take. And I think we've got a couple of roving mics that we can bring to people. So I think we've got a question up here. Yeah, okay. I think we just give you one.
Good evening. Now, if we look at the history of the humble computer, you had Turing's machine, ENIAC, the Cray 1 supercomputer, desktops and laptops, up into the quantum computer. Now, in your particular industry, compared to the humble computer, from 1945 to now, that's about 74 years. Now the question is, a rocket is a rocket, no matter what it's propelled by. So where did the technology go, if you compare that to the humble computer? Where did the technology go?
Jim, you're all about the rockets. I'm not answering the question.
There we go. I got it. Where did the technology go? Well, essentially the technology went into how we manufacture the rockets and how we control them as much as anything. I mean, the physics of rocket propulsion, the engineering that goes behind rocket propulsion hasn't changed. We can't change the laws of physics or the laws of science. What we are doing is changing the way that we're making them. And if you look at Rocket Lab, they're a perfect example. They're 3D printing their engines. You know, that would have been unheard of sort of even, several decades ago. If you look at the technology that goes into the satellites themselves, it's getting smaller and smaller to the point where we can do real science now with a 10-centimeter cube. So where you think the technology or the hypothesis is the technology hasn't changed. What hasn't changed is the laws of physics and the laws of science. But everything around that, the manufacturability of it, that has changed tremendously. We're building carbon fiber rockets with 3D printed motors driven by batteries, right? That's how far we've come.
I think we had another one just here. We'll just wait for a microphone just for a second, just because we are live streaming. So. Thanks.
Thanks. A couple of presenters have sort of focused on value as being, you know, the original driver of all the work that follows. Is there any current value analysis that looks, say, even in the New Zealand context of what the effort goes into versus the value we get out of it? And that might be financial value, it might be other sort of benefits, even social benefits. Is there anything out there that even looks at internationally, you know, what the bang for the buck is of the technology and how that's scaling against the tech curve and what we're capable of now? Because it seems to me if we identify the value, that does tend to drive a lot of the activity that follows, and that falls into the models that you're putting in front of us for how this whole space could develop. Right.
Who's going to jump up for that one?
I can have a go.
No, thanks, John. Basically, look, what I would say is, with any endeavor, so I teach engineering management, all right, that's my stock and trade. So one of the things that I have to get across to my engineering students constantly is it doesn't matter how good your idea is. If you cannot build a business case around that, it will not progress. You know, it's like, oh, boss, I got this great thing, you know, we can build this widget. Yeah, okay, who's going to buy it? Oh, well, everybody will buy it. Well, okay, well, show me that. All right, show me that people will buy it, and then we'll put some money into it. We're doing research at the university. We're doing research in private industry. We're doing startups now. All of those things have to have a business case around them. So when when Nick applies for grants, okay, when Williams has a business startup, you know, and they're attracting finance, they have to have a business case around them. So you ask, where's the bang for buck? That has to, every case has to prove its value before it progresses, and that's just the way it is. That's the way of the world at the moment. I don't know whether that is the kind of thing you're looking for.
I'm sort of interested whether someone has done an analysis of what's actually been happening over the last few years. The reason why people have invested, either for academic, social, or scientific reasons to get the stuff out there and do things.
I think that's probably the sort of thing you have to ask Andrew at MB. That's more of a national.
I can offer an observation, at least. So I'm not an economist. I'm a scientist. But what we notice is that there is a move towards doing space smaller and with more. What that means is there are corporations who are looking at, for instance, providing global internet using a swarm of small satellites. And we're not talking about 2 or 3, we're talking about thousands. So there are going to be thousands of these things up in space. Part of the reason why our students are concerned about this is like, well, what are you going to do with those things when they die? And so we're addressing that with, you know, a real project to bring them down at the end of life safely as a kaitiakitanga exercise in protecting a finite resource. Leaving that aside, looking towards how the world is moving to the utilization of space, it is through these small satellites, which are all themselves quite powerful. And so when we look at it, we say, okay, what's the value that we presume that these companies are not doing this just for the hell of it. They're looking at this as a viable business case for providing the services they want to provide. And we wish to buy into that. We wish to invest in that. We wish to invest in our institutions across the country so that we can get our technical expertise, get our scientific expertise, get our way of doing business into these global supply chains, so that when we build the next best widget, which is about yay big, small, high value, easily transportable across the world, we can compete internationally. That's what we're aiming to do. Now, whether that's economically actually going to actually happen, I'm not the economist, but this is what we're predicating a lot of our work on.
Okay, so maybe I can put some hard numbers in there because I think that's maybe what you're after. So each year there is an annual survey around the world of return on investment on various parts of the economy. Typically, aerospace is about 8 to 1. For every dollar you put in, you expect about $8 back. As a comparison, tourism is about 1.03. So, and if you look at the developed countries, why are they developed? And what areas do they choose? You look at Japan or Germany, aerospace engineering is usually one of the first things that gets developed.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I am an economist, and I would say one of the reasons that the New Zealand government is interested in supporting the space industry to develop in New Zealand is because it is the high skill, high R&D, export-oriented, capital-intensive industry that we kind of need to raise our productivity performance, which has been a big problem for the overall economy for at least the last 30 years. So that's a key rationale for why the government's involved.
I have a question, if I can, sorry. To the Kessler team lead, from one interested student to another, can you talk to us about how your team came to be and like how multidisciplinary they really are?
I can. So, as a brief history, we actually entered about 2 years ago in the first CubeSat challenge. We lost because, I don't know, our team, it was partly our team, partly our idea and our strategy. It wasn't fully formed, and we came back and we re-entered with more people, a better team. I'd like to say better management, but I was the management, so that's... and yeah, we won. I think Jim put it really well about how it is definitely multifaceted. You need the humanities to give you the idea in the first place. When we won, when we started off, we had a person on our team who delved deep into the science. We got scientists to, because fundamentally we didn't know what we were doing. We had to delve deep into the science and the physics behind tethers to first off figure out if they'd work, if so, how would they work, how would we fit them in. And it was only then once he did the research into it, did the analysis, did all the hard maths, and he came back and he told us, okay, it can work if you do it this way or if you do it this way. And now me, the engineer, and the other people are coming in and are saying, okay, now that you've given us numbers, now we're trying to fit it into the space that we have. I think it actually, from what I've seen, it really closely follows what Jim said. The scientists had to tell us, actually, yeah, this is possible or this isn't possible first. My advice to you as the team would be make sure it works, prove that it works, or find out how it can work, especially in terms of convincing those people. Yeah, prove that it will work and that you can get it to work.
Another one here.
Hi, first of all, thank you for this opportunity as well, for speaking to all of us, keen, eager people. My questions are more along the lines of, Dr. Muller, you mentioned how New Zealand would be fitting itself into this sort of continuum or into global relevance. Has there been much talk along any of the goals or future deadlines we can expect to find our endeavours or our accomplishments by?
So I don't know that there's any deadlines per se, but I think there is an opportunity right now. I'm a big believer in momentum. As you get something going and you get people behind it, and then if you can continue that enthusiasm, then you can help build something. So we have a start. We've got a lot of interest. You're all here, and there's enthusiasm. And the other thing about space is it captures people's imagination. It captures their imagination. It gets them excited. I tell people, I work for NASA. I'm like, yeah. They're like, oh my gosh. They think it's the coolest thing. I give them a sticker and you think that I've just, it's made of gold. So that childlike curiosity and inspiration that space brings about with it, let's capture that, and there's no deadline. That's not going away. Yet there is an opportunity here that's unique because there's a lot of momentum around small satellites and accessibility, and suddenly what seemed like it was the paradigm of the large, the NASAs and the JAXAs and the ESAs, now you've got smaller nations actually engaging alongside them and being taken seriously, and they're part of the overall human effort that brings us together in terms of curiosity, science, and exploration. So we should seize that opportunity.
My question was more along the lines of how those goals would be, if we knew those goals, if we're able to work on them behind the scenes and more so direct our endeavours behind the scenes rather than just being eager but with direction, if that makes sense.
So that's why, and again, it's coming from my perspective as an engineer and as a payload person, so I realize that I'm going to be somewhat skewed by my background. But in the efforts that I've been involved in, they have formulated around, and kind of like what Jim said, we start off with our question. That question might be, how does this serve humanity, or a science question? But then as you need to get to the point that you can then communicate these things to the engineers who will actually build it. And so in doing so, in kind of that cycle that Jim was alluding to, that focuses it in. It's like, okay, here's our question. Now that focuses, we need to know this, we need to know that, we need to know that. And here are the people and the expertise and the technologies that we need to engage. And so that becomes the thing that you congregate around, is that common goal. So.
Other questions in the room? I think there's one over here.
This is for anyone on the panel. One of the core problems of being in space is the energy required to run these satellites and various ventures. And we've talked about batteries. Lithium ion has decay problems, so they're not going to last indefinitely. What's the attitude on fission and fusion mini reactors or different types of battery technology for actually driving these?
So they've handed the microphone to the physicist. Okay. Yeah, all right, so it should actually be a matter for the material science, I suppose, development, but you're exactly right. I mean, there is this issue where we hand over a satellite to Rocket Lab, it sits in the launch vehicle with a lithium-ion battery, we hope that when it gets up there, the solar panels will charge the thing up and off it will go. And that all of it will work for a significant length of the mission life, yes. So we are, and power is one of those finite resources on a CubeSat which you have to manage very well. It's more than just, oh, the battery's a bit flat, we'll just keep on going. If the battery's flat and the computer can't run and you're not convinced that, oh, well, it browns out and then it tries to start itself again and it's not enough power, it can send itself into a terrible loop and you have no control over the satellite. So yes, power is an extraordinarily difficult thing to manage and extraordinarily important. As in terms of finding different technologies for powering, you asked a specific question, fission and fusion. Fusion is a little bit out of the realms of possibilities, certainly with a small CubeSat, until we discover some new physics. I'll get back to you on that. In terms of fission, perhaps, or maybe more generally radioactive decay to produce power, leaving aside the issues regarding whether that's a good idea environmentally or if indeed it's safe, there is a whole field of what they call beta voltaics, which is a way of producing power, very tiny amounts of power to out of nuclear decay products. And this is of an interest to me personally, and the question is whether you can get enough essentially juice out of one of these things to do anything useful with it. But we're also contemplating going even smaller than a CubeSat format. So we're gesturing here with, with the view of a 1U CubeSat in my hand. There are missions being contemplated which go in even smaller, so small chipsats which themselves still need power, but instead of sending up a lithium battery, maybe we can use some of these these new technologies for generating power. So yes, we are thinking beyond the standard solar panel plus lithium-ion battery. I'm also interested in things like what can you do with fuel cell technologies? I mean, you can have a fuel cell on a tiny chip. Can you utilize that in space in any kind of meaningful way? I don't know the answer to that, but I need to talk to my friends in microfluidics, microfabrication, and see whether this sort of thing is possible. But since we're thinking small, we can also think different. Does that answer your question satisfactorily?
Yeah. Is there any legal implications of using nuclear power in space?
I would suspect so.
Yes, there is. There's been certain controversies around various launches and the safety of where you launch them, and if the launch fails, what happens with this payload, with this, stuff falling into the ocean. So yeah, there are.
Just a fun little note about generating power in orbit. Electrodynamic tethers that I'm working on, they actually generate power orbiting the Earth, and it doesn't necessarily make sense in low Earth orbit because you're effectively trading off your orbit velocity for energy, So it's like, oh yeah, I got energy, but I deorbited in like a month. But there's been some fantastic research done into using a tether to come into orbit around Jupiter and use the tether to slow down and brake. And in doing that, because of Jupiter's intense magnetic fields, you generate like a megawatt of power. Good fun. So, you know, maybe that's an option.
Maybe another one just down here.
This is a question I asked on the Slido thing as well. But so Rocket Lab, big success story for New Zealand, kind of put New Zealand on the space map, you know, with apologies to all your previous efforts. But it's a company that's headquartered in California. Should we care about that? And if we do care about that, what could we do to make New Zealand have a fully self-sustaining entrepreneurial ecosystem for space, which doesn't, for example, rely on and get partially controlled by outside capital?
It might be quite a good one for hear from Will as a startup, because I'm sure finance is a big part of the question.
Yeah, so I'd say I won't answer the first part of the question, which is should we care? I'll answer the second one, which is probably look to the reasons why Rocket Lab first moved away in the first place. And Peter Beck has been pretty open about. He said, you know, funding was a big component of why he had to move. US VCs can be a bit touchy around. They don't like to put a massive amount of money in a company that isn't from the US. So that would probably be one of the reasons to perhaps that would be an area to focus on. I think apart from that, New Zealand works quite well with the US. We have some sort of memorandum of cooperation with the FAA. So I'd probably say funding is one of the big sort of easy things to perhaps mitigate to keep companies here.
I was involved in the funding of Rocket Lab. I was an advisor early in the piece. Rocket Lab wouldn't be off the ground if it hadn't got US funding. There was nobody in New Zealand that would fund it. And to be honest with you, one of the lessons you should learn is the reason Peter, I think, has been able to continue to get the funding he's got is he has good quality investors that give subsequent investors the confidence to actually continue to back him. So, you know, it's all well and good to say, can we keep it in New Zealand, all of that sort of thing, but for entrepreneurs who are trying to start up, their obligation is to themselves and what they get out of it, rather than necessarily the sort of New Zealand Inc. And you're right, the reason, let's be honest with you, the reason he's in the US is you've got a whole lot of investors who are totally comfortable with a Delaware company. They don't have to go and get separate legal advice to get them what's a New Zealand company, what's the New Zealand Companies Act. So I think that was done partly because of access to funding, but also it makes it easy for the investor.
Oh, sorry, we've just got a follow-up over here. Sorry, just
Thanks,
1 second.
yeah. That would fit quite well to the question before. Question to Will, in terms of being a startup founder in New Zealand. Do you mind sharing maybe some lessons learned you gained within the first month, or are there any tips you can give to newcomers, what you wouldn't do or what you definitely do again?
I'd say probably that New Zealand is a country that's pretty small and you can probably get a meeting with almost anyone. So key is to probably have good advisors and ask a lot of questions. There's a lot of people in this country that are willing to give help. So yeah, an opportunity to learn from best principles is particularly easy here. It's probably my big advice. So good for asking.
Right, then we had one over here.
Hi. Why is synthetic aperture radar so important, and what other kind of sensors, you know, are going to be important in the future, sort of, you know, for future applications? Thanks.
Well, so synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, is a very powerful technique. I mean, that's where I spent a lot of my career. The real benefits, and I'm not, you know, I'm a fan of all technologies because they all give you different aspects of different information, and so if we can pull it all together, you know more than if you just have one in isolation. But the big advantages of SAR is you have your own illuminator. It's an active sensor, so you can see through clouds, you can see at night, and a lot of the time we can't see things with other sensors because of cloud cover, and it's just a simple thing that we're not getting around. And that, for New Zealand, is being Aotearoa is a real problem a lot of the time. The other things around SAR is it's high resolution all weather. So, and you can get different aspects from different frequencies and applying polarimetry, interferometry. There's all kinds of advanced techniques you can use in order to get different aspects of whatever it is you're looking for. The second part of your question was future?
Yeah, what other sensors might be important in the future?
I think the range of sensors is fairly well, you know, you've kind of got a myriad of, you've got your passive, active, LiDAR, and spectro, you know, optical and various parts of the spectrum. So it's more advances in the sensitivities of those, or the ways that we can get more data, better data, high resolution. You know, it's the way that we combine the information that will make the advances. The other thing is, as the platform changes, our spatiotemporal sampling will change, and that, especially for things that are dynamic processes, it gives us a better way of viewing those. And that's what, you know, having constellations of small sats really opens up a new sampling space that you can't necessarily get from one big satellite that repeats every few days or every few weeks. Instead, you've got a cognizance that you wouldn't have before just because of the platform. So it's a combination of the platform, the sensor, the geometry, and the spatiotemporal sampling. I'd like to hear from the young lady up there, if that's okay.
What has been the biggest accomplishment in space research in the past 10 years?
I think if you ask anyone here, everyone's going to have a different opinion on that. So, gosh. What got me excited in the past 10 years and maybe got me back to New Zealand is the capability that Rocket Lab brought, not in the small sats, but in the fact that now space is accessible for young countries like New Zealand that maybe can't put up $1 billion satellite, but they can put up a satellite that does something really good because it's now accessible. So we can actually do something pretty exciting here now. Anyone else?
I'll add that two missions I've been quite excited by recently is the now retiring Kepler Space Telescope. So that discovered about 3,500 exoplanets, so planets around other stars. That's pretty cool because, you know, a couple of decades ago we weren't sure as to whether there were many exoplanets. The other one would be New Horizons. So as a kid, we'd not had any sort of close approach of Pluto. And so seeing high resolution photos come through, and I think it was 2014, for me was pretty cool.
I can say. It hasn't really been done, obviously, but the idea of colonizing other planets, I think that's quite a cool idea. A while ago, I did a competition for how much money would it take to colonize the moon. And I found that was really interesting, and you look at all the natural materials and what you could do to do that, and I thought that was really cool and was something I was really interested in. Yeah.
I mean, obviously my answer is somewhat biased, but I think the introduction of CubeSats and small sats, well, if it weren't for that, like, there was no way I would have the opportunity, least of all being from New Zealand, to actually build something that would go into space. I'd have to try and go overseas. Not that the US would let someone not from the US work on a satellite, and try and work on a multi-billion-dollar company, and maybe have a small role on building a satellite. But here I get to actually be in charge of a team doing it, and it's incredible and ridiculous that that's actually a thing that I can do. It's incredible.
They do let people from New Zealand do that.
Do they actually? How?
Okay, I think there's another gentleman up here. Yep.
Yes, my question's around what are we doing here in New Zealand in terms of democratizing access to space resources and space data, particularly relevant or applicable to our GDP sectors, and so agriculture data, environmental data, Earth observation data. What are we doing here to democratize access to that?
Looking at the government official for an answer. I think it's fair to say the government's at the start of a journey of understanding how we can be better at raising awareness, not only within the government but within the wider New Zealand society about what the applications of Earth observation data could be and how we could be smarter about acquiring data when we do make the decision to do that. But it's certainly something that the government's interested in seeing if we can do a lot more efficiently than we have in the past.
I just might add to that one of the things that's happening in space now is it's becoming privatized. So the availability of data, it's just simply a matter of buying it. It doesn't need to be democratized so much anymore. It's now commercial industry. And that commercial industry, like everything else, is available for sale. You know, we don't have to go behind the Iron Curtain or behind the US curtain or whatever it happens to be anymore. You know, that data's out there.
And also along those lines, there's really a thought along that data has to be bought. There's an awful lot of freely available data. So I come from, my background is NASA, that's where most of my career has been. All NASA data is free and it's freely available globally. And that's the case with a number of the satellites and a number of the space agencies up there. So there is a lot of data available and people don't realize that it is, but it's there and it's accessible for everybody.
This chap here. Oh, sorry, didn't see that.
I put this question on the Slido thing, but
there's too many questions in the room.
Yeah. So is New Zealand's geographical isolation a significant problem in terms of importing specialised components? And if so, how do we solve this? This is directed at everybody, I guess.
So the question was, is our isolation a problem for obtaining the hardware and componentry that we need? Look, I buy a lot of stuff on AliExpress. It's never been a problem for me. I don't think it's an isolation anymore. You know, I think it's just business as usual now.
I have an amusing comment. Yes, you can be the judge. So one of the interesting things about trying to build a satellite and trying to come up with a program like this out of whole cloth, starting from scratch, and you don't have decades of space engineering behind you like at JPL, like at NASA, where these people have wrestled with these problems over decades, are the little things that you don't expect to really be a problem. Space glue. Who knew there was such a thing? But it makes complete sense. So when you build a satellite, well, certainly for the satellites that we're building, you need to glue the things together. Once you've figured out, yep, I'm happy that goes there, that goes there, that goes there, these things are all put together, you're right. Now, basically you dip it all in glue, or rather, you affix everything properly so that it doesn't shake apart during launch. Now, there are only a few types of glue which are space rated. You can't just glue it together with, Yoo-hoo or, whatever super glue you find in the drawer. You have to make sure, we have to be able to tell Rocket Lab about everything that is going into their launch vehicle, down to the glue that we used. And if we don't use the right glue, they might say, well, hey, that stuff's not space rated. It could suddenly start to evaporate, outgas, boil. Stuff might behave very strangely under cold temperatures or vacuum. So they want to know, what glue did you use? And if that glue is not on the list of space rated material, then they could quite reasonably say, sorry, we're not going to launch because it might damage our spacecraft and all the other missions that fly with you. So we're on the hunt for space glue. That fell onto my desk, which was an interesting exercise because it was like, glue, okay, where do I buy space glue from? And importantly, how do I get it into the country? It is the particular glues that we're looking at were particular epoxies. They were, I'm not a glue expert, but it was, I learned a lot. They are very dangerous to transport. And so I was calling Air New Zealand saying, how do I get this stuff into the country? I need to build a satellite. Well, how much do you need? Litres? No, I need, how much? Oh, very difficult. So those little things, take up an extraordinary amount of time. It isn't the big questions like, ooh, what should we observe? That's fun. That's the fun part. The hard part is space glue. And it's a heck of a lot more fun than the paperwork you have to do, which has largely been falling on Jim's shoulders and others in the university. But just to give you an idea of, it sounds very glamorous and it sounds very exciting in the same way that discovering planets sounds very glamorous and exciting, but the reality is you spend a lot of your time in front of a computer wondering why your code's not working and it's all falling over. In the same way, building a satellite, there's a lot of space glue involved.
Right, I think we had a question here.
My question relates to APSS and time management. I was wondering if the students could perhaps talk to how well you've managed to keep a track of doing studies and maintaining a good balance between doing such a time-demanding extracurricular activity and also maintaining the best academic achievements that you can.
What social life? It's not easy. Just like it isn't. I manage it, but it's difficult. I manage it because I've spent a lot of time trying to learn how to do it. In my second year, I was on the Formula SAE team, and I had to juggle that and university, and that wasn't easy. But I slowly learnt, just simply by sort of like a trial by fire, jumping in the deep end, I slowly learnt how best to actually manage my time. It's not easy. You can find 1,000 different ways on how to do it and beat procrastination and organize your life. I've got no secret tips for you, unfortunately. You just genuinely have to jump in there. Believing in what I'm doing helps. I actually want to dedicate a significant portion of my time to what I'm doing, which does actually help a lot. Sorry if I haven't really helped. It's not an easy question to answer.
Is there a sense of just how much time?
Too much. Well, to be fair, I'm the leader of the team, so I put in far too much. I sort of have to. I could quantify it by like 15, 20 hours a week. For me personally, I don't expect that of my team members. I sort of take what they can get.
I mean, so for me, I have 2 jobs outside of uni in Kesler. So it can be quite full on, but when you find something that you really love, it's really easy to find time for it. One of my biggest problems is I don't have enough time to give as much time as I want to Kesler. The workload can vary, so sometimes you're just waiting and you just have nothing to do. Other times you've got so much to do.
Sorry again.
It's fine, I can study. It depends, I guess. But finding schedules, I use schedules to maintain my time and just outside of life as well.
Make lists. Lists are really useful.
Just as a sort of follow-up as well to Jim, on the other side of that, do you find it beneficial that your students have sort of split focus because it kind of it weans out the ones that are more likely to be successful are the ones that can handle time demands like that, or have you put in anything to sort of reduce workload to try and combat that?
Ever put anything in place to reduce the workload for the students?
No.
No. Look, to be perfectly honest with you, as with anything in life, the successful ones are driven. The successful ones are the high achievers. If you're not ambitious, you won't last at it. It really is that simple. And that's the same with anything. That's the same with a degree. That's the same with learning how to ski. That's the same with anything in life, really. The students that we get involved do tend to be quite high achievers. I mean, I'm always just blown away with what they can achieve, when they're left to their own devices. And we very much leave them to their own devices, and that's in part deliberate. That's part of the experience that I try and give them. I mean, I'm an old fellow. The reason that I do this is because I like to mess with the minds of the next generation. And that's basically what we do. We give them an opportunity to stretch and expand.
A quick question about the competitiveness of the space industry. How does New Zealand compete with other nations for international investment? And how do we keep that investment? So what is our competitive advantage, or at least our comparative advantage in this industry as we go forward?
Anybody?
So I'd say as in New Zealand, so one thing that we've identified internally as our unfair advantage would be how small, let's say, the New Zealand Space Agency is. A group of 3 engineers would never have a meeting with probably anybody from NASA, particularly sort of higher up the NASA sort of command chain. We could turn up to them, and the New Zealand Space Agency is usually fairly friendly to us. Also, New Zealand is probably unique in that it has a very friendly relationship with both the European Space Agency, and NASA, which is probably unusual compared to a lot of countries. So yeah, I think that we're actually well positioned to probably remain globally competitive in this industry.
I suppose for me, one of the things that I want to do too, part of the APSS is encouraging startups. I come from an industry background, not an academic one. And, you know, Will and the Zeno team are a shining example. But one of the things we're good at in New Zealand, and I say we, I might talk funny, but I've been here more than half my life now, is doing small things particularly well, so niche market. So we're, you know, Rocket Lab is, I don't really want to say an exception, you know, we could have several Rocket Labs, but we're very good at doing small things extremely well, so niche markets, and I think that's possibly a very good place for us to head.
Okay, I think unfortunately we're going to have to wrap it up there, but it was fantastic to see all those questions coming in. We had a number also on the Slido tool as well. I didn't go to that just because there were so many coming in from the people who've come here today. So, so thanks so much for all the questions. I think we just obviously need to say a special thank you to our panellists who've come along today and shared their expertise and insights, and maybe if everyone could just give them a clap. And also thank you again to our partners, the University of Auckland and Auckland Uni Services, for helping make this event possible and what I think has been a great success. So maybe another clap. And if just a final note, if you are interested in what the Space Agency is doing, then I encourage you to visit MBIE's website, www.mbie.govt.nz/NZ Space Agency. And check out what we're doing. We're very keen to hear from people who have interesting ideas, who are interested in making the sector develop and grow here in New Zealand. So do get in touch. We are small and we can respond relatively quickly, I think, especially compared to some of the behemoth agencies from overseas. So I think you're right, Will, to identify that as an advantage. And we'd really love to hear from you. We think this is a sector that's got a really exciting future and one that I think has greater relevance to the broader economic development of the country. So thanks again, everyone, for coming along, and do please stay in touch with what happens in the sector. Thank you.